It was a Friday afternoon in March, 4:47 p.m. to be exact, because I glanced at my phone as Keith began talking and I was timing how long this would take since the 5 o'clock traffic, and instead I stood there while he told me in front of 30 people in an open plan office on the 14th floor of a building that I had helped build profitable, that I was done. He did not summon me to an office. That is the detail to which I always return. Not words, not even shame, but the deliberate decision to leave a room unused. There were rooms available. Keith had a corner office with a door and a frosted glass panel that was purpose-built to keep something like this from spilling out into the hallway. And on that floor alone there were 4 conference rooms. He did not rely on any of them instead. He walked out to the center of the floor, to the space between rows of desks where people congregate for casual conversations, and he waited until Simone had looked away from her screen and Dana had appeared from the break room, and at least 15 people could see what was about to happen. And then he said my name, and then he said the things he said. This isn't working anymore. The opener, mild, almost reasonable. You missed the divisional standard for quarter performance. Not a pause, but the making of a pause. The beat that a man takes when he wants to seem more considered than vengeful. It's not you, it's us. I stood there. The floor had that kind of stillness of people pretending not to listen but listening with all the attention. I felt Simone not looking. A chill went through the break room. I could sense Dana in her doorway. And then, here is the key, bottom line portion. The part that tells you all you need to know about Keith Dalton. He added 4 words that he didn't have to add. 4 words that had no business being there, which HR would never have approved of, that were only there as a signal in the room, and to me part of what I was afforded power, part of what had none. He said, "You won't be working here again. Not in this division. Not this firm. Here. This city." A city that he did not own and hadn't built. A city in which, as it would turn out, he enjoyed far less power than he thought. I looked at him for a moment. I have often thought about what I looked like in that moment, and to be frank, I don't know. The only person who saw me was Simone, and she said I looked completely still, which is fair because I was not frozen, still, a person lapsing into quiet, drawing up a substance and in the moment choosing not to respond how they 1003 are being primed to react. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not speak to the floor or to Keith or to the 15 people staring anywhere but at me. I replied softly with Keith, "All right. Just that." So I went back to my desk and I packed it. It fits into a single cardboard box, which should have told me something about how little of me I had stayed with that job, how much I had given it, and how small the room in which my donation could find meaning as coming from me. 1 box. 6 years. I taped it closed, picked it up, walked towards the elevator, and walked out. In the parking structure I threw the box in my trunk. I sat in the driver's seat. And I allowed myself to feel it. The act of devastation at something being publicly done. The humility of more, or less being ended in front of an audience. The drained emotion after 6 years boiled down to this isn't working anymore. It took me exactly 7 minutes to sit with that. How do I know this? Because I was watching the clock. Alone. For 7 minutes, in my car, in the parking garage. And then, I picked up the phone and called Marcus Hale. He picked up on the second ring, like he always did. And before I could manage more than his name, he said, "I heard. Dana called me." A pause. "Let me know what comes next, 'cause no matter what it is, I'm down." I was in my car in the parking garage of a company who had recently said I would never work in this town again. And I started to think what was going next for me, and for the first time since 4:47 p.m. Hal on October 2 hit something inside me that had been braced unclenched. Because Marcus Hale had only then told me that the one thing Keith Dalton believed he had managed to destroy was on the phone before me, ready and willing to follow me anywhere. "I'm with you. Give me the weekend." "Take 2, he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I drove home. I did not make plans. Dinner, the banal television viewing at home, when I slept. And Saturday morning I woke up and started building. Because while they may not know it yet, you need to understand Keith Dalton. Because understanding Keith is what makes everything that follows make sense. Not as revenge but inevitability. Keith was not a stupid man, which is important to be saying because stupid men tend to go away. And Keith was not going anywhere. He was intelligent in the way of people who are great at managing up, and not so great everywhere else, outstanding at the performance of leadership, but middling at its actual exercise. He had an ease with senior stakeholders, a knack for being in the right room at the right time, and an almost instinctive ability to claim credit for things others had done, but was just vague enough on to avoid repercussions. For 4 of the 6 years I spent at Meridian, I reported to Keith. For the first 2, I was sufficiently far removed from any kind of influence to be under a manager who saw my work clearly and told me so. And then she left and the restructure happened. I was placed in Keith's division and I logged 4 years learning how expensive it is to work for a man who has to be top dog at all times. He seems not so much threatened by competent women as wheezed from the same animal that heads off competition. Not confronting you but subduing you, contain you. He never said anything actionable. That was his skill. Nothing that could be transcribed and scrutinized under the glare of HR, simply the structural. The visible projects that went to men, the client meetings I prepped for which he then attended, my quarterly reviews with solid numbers and his articulation of those numbers made them appear adequate. That hepatogastric drip, slow and nearly imperceptible, of management down, just useful enough to keep alive, and just unacknowledged enough not to rise. I just want to be upfront with you about what I did with that, because I do not emerge from this part of the story smelling like roses. What I did was stay. I remained there for 4 years and told myself the work stood for itself, that the results would surely ring so loudly they couldn't be ignored, that the account I'd founded, one I'll tell you about in Act 2, was too large and too obviously mine to be extinguished. That staying and doing well is the path I told myself. I was wrong about that. Surviving, thriving even in a system built by one who needs you small is not a plan. It's a delay. The firing was always coming. I just didn't realize it until it was here. What I couldn't yet realize, what I wouldn't grasp until the Monday after that Friday, sitting across from Jerome with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad, was all of the bottled experience Keith had just opened for me, was precisely what I'd need to launch something fresh out on my own. Every skill he failed to promote, every client relationship he'd permitted me to form, because he wasn't fully convinced it was valuable, all of the institutional knowledge I'd earned, while being shut out from title and salary. It was mine, all mine. He'd been storing it for me. He just simply did not know what he put away. The take, away from being caged by someone who thinks you have less power than you do, is that the caging has its limits. Your whole container is not larger than what they believe you are worth. And when they finally kick you out of the club, they always eventually kick you out. Because at some point, you are a bigger threat than asset. They throw everything away that none of them ever really understood was in their hands. This was what Keith catapulted into the parking garage with me on a Friday in March. 6 years of all the things he refused to see. I loaded it up in the trunk and drove home. Saturday morning I started using it. Hale & Partners is where everything starts, so let me talk about them. In my 2nd year at Meridian, I cold called Marcus Hale. Not because it was assigned to me. It wasn't. Not because it was included in my quarterly targets. None of that made any list. I did it because I had read a write-up of his firm in an industry journal, and because I knew something about what they needed that I thought we could help with, and also because through the sheer magic of being someone in their 20s who never learned to ask for permission before undertaking something that felt blatantly right, I called his assistant and explained that I had a proposal for Meridian that would help improve something in their operations, if only they could spare 20 minutes for me to explain. Mr. Hale. He didn't take cold calls, the assistant said. I told him that if he'd give me 20 minutes and found it worthless, I'd never call again, even 15 if helpful. The assistant put me through 17 minutes of Marcus Hale time. He ended this 17 minutes by saying, "Forward me a proper proposal, and I'll take a look this week." I sent it that afternoon. 30 days later, he put pen to paper. The account began with a $400,000 per year salary. It grew to $2.4 million a year over 36 months as I got clearer on their business and created more of what they needed. Meridian's largest account by far. That equated, I know, as I had seen the revenue numbers, to about 18% of that division's annual revenues. At every board meeting, Keith raised it as a divisional success. The room where they made the cold call, the first pitch, and the first dozen client meetings was not with him. He went into the annual reviews, shook Marcus's hand and said proper things like, "Our team has done great work here." Marcus knew. Marcus always knew. Marcus, as a man who knows precisely where value Ray comes from, had spent 4 years quietly taking note of how the work got done versus who actually took credit for it. The first call Marcus made when Keith fired me was to Dana, Keith's assistant, to see if what he'd heard was true. The second call was to me. The third call, the one I learned about much later, was made to his own attorney and simply asked what he owed Meridian under his contract and how soon he could change his account without being penalized. The answer was 60 days. That weekend he began the process of transitioning. 2 months after they lost me, Meridian lost Hale & Partners to a firm that would be formed 3 weeks later by a woman they'd publicly humiliated on a Friday afternoon. They never really made the connection between those two events. Keith especially believed that Marcus was gone for unrelated reasons. The nature of the market, a pitch received from a rival, clients could be quixotic TLC. He never even knew that when he fired me, he had fired the account. He just didn't know it yet. I already knew this from the parking garage. I knew it the second Marcus said, "Whatever this is, I'm in." After all this, I drove home with a box and $2.4 million worth of future revenue in my phone's recent calls screen. Keith thought he'd ended me. He'd funded me. That difference between those two things was one phone call and the particular loyalty of a client who always knew where the real work came from. The signs were there. I'm not writing about them because I believe that they were things I should have acted on earlier. I'm not sure if I should have or could have, and second, guessing the past is the least constructive form of intelligence. But rather because they tell you something about how Keith worked that serves to elucidate what he did and why he thought he could get away with it. Your first indication was the promotion that never arrived. 3 times. In 4 years, positions I clearly should have been the internal candidate force, and that were given to men with less time and worse numbers, coupled with a specific qualification of being unthreatening to Keith's sense of himself. Each time there was a reason. At every juncture the excuse was only credible enough for me to officially process it and put it behind me. First time, "Why would like to give you some more runway before the title change." Third time, "We're sorry, but the account review process doesn't line up." The third time, and this is the one I should have fought against harder than I did, he said, "You are too valuable where you currently are for me to move you. Too valuable to promote." I nodded. I filed it. I should have listened to it as what it was, a man directly telling me that my value to him hinged on my staying just below him. The second indicator, considered, was the performance appraisal at the time leading up to 3 months before the termination. My cadence numbers were robust. Hale & Partners had just renewed at the new rate, and a couple of smaller accounts I had driven were growing in steady measure. The review itself should have been simple. Instead, Keith introduced a novel metric: cross-divisional visibility, which did not exist in any earlier performance review, on which I struggled, because I'd done my actual job in my division, but without attending the cross-divisional networking functions that Keith loved to frequent. It was a contrived deficiency established retrospectively to create a documentation trail. I saw it clearly at the time. I told Simone. I did not put any formal step. I should have. I didn't. The third sign was Dana. Keith's assistant had been with him 7 years, an unsung genius at knowing everything, while saying nothing that I've always admired. The firing is a day, and 3 weeks before it, she found me in the break room in 3 different sentences without context or set up. Quietly said and quote, "Organize your files." Nothing else. She went back to her desk. I paused with my coffee in hand and thought about everything that meant. Then I decided it meant lay off, not fired. I can be plenty good later. And my account numbers were far too strong to get kicked to the curb. I was wrong. She knew exactly what was coming next. She was the best human being in that office, and gave me whatever warning she could in her one language, which I didn't know how to translate. I share all of this with you because it is relevant to what happened after. The signs were there, and I read them wrong, and I stayed too long, not because I'm stupid, but because I dutifully believe that excellence protects you. It doesn't always save you. It keeps you safe from a few things, but it cannot save you from Keith Dalton, who is afraid of excellence not because he needs to be, but because it endangers him and has made a career out of working every angle with his tools to hack it down. What saves you from a Keith Dalton is getting the hell out of there before he ejects you. Or, at best, walking away, leaving everything he doesn't know he's throwing away along with you. I failed the first option. I executed the second one. Not by design. Thanks pure and simple to a client who answered the phone on a Friday evening and said, "Whatever it is, count me in." Sometimes the shield comes in the form of something you quietly built when the world was somehow not chronicling how things went down, and it shows up right when you needed it. In a parking garage on a Friday, 60 seconds after your worst moment as a professional. On Saturday, I woke at 6 without an alarm and spent precisely 10 minutes in bed before getting up, because there was nothing for me rolling around in the sheets and everything to be found on the legal pad at the kitchen table. I made coffee. I sat down. I started writing. I wish to recount those 48 hours because they represent, in the kind of way that only moments arrive which everything comes into focus at once, the most generative and productive period in my working career. Getting fired had removed all forms of reluctance I had with me, all of the "not quite yet," and "not a good time," or "you have so much more value where you are now," all of it out in that instant, cauterized by the specific heat of being told to not even bother looking for work in this town again. 30 people heard the humiliation. You stop asking for permission to be a little more of a figure in your own life. When someone figuratively robs you of the mic like that, the first thing I wrote down on the legal pad was the name of the firm. I had been mulling it as we drove home the night before, and I had it ready, clean, easy to understand, no need for explanatory subtitles. I wrote it down, circled it, and kept going. Secondly were the client list. Not just Marcus. I re-examined every relationship I had built in 6 years and honestly questioned if they were relationships with me or with Meridian. This is the indispensable difference, and the one that governs what you truly take with you when leaving a position. Institutional customers are to be associated with establishment. The relationships based on personal trust, based on the idiosyncratic nature of how you show up and think and deliver. Those come with you anyway, because they were never really even the company's to begin with. They were yours. The company simply was the address at which they could reach you. I uncovered 4 accounts that fell into that category. Marcus was the anchor. The other 3 were sort of lighter weight but nevertheless real. Folks who had actually called me, myself, when they needed something, not some generic number. That weekend I didn't call them. During the notice period, however, that would have been inappropriate. I just knew, but I wrote down their names on the legal pad. The third thing was Jerome. That same week I was fired, Jerome too had been overlooked for the 3rd time. Another context, another manager, another pretense, but a repeat. The same story. Good companies tell you when they have made a decision to keep something in a certain order and are looking for ways to rationalize it. Jerome was the sharpest analytical mind in the division, but he'd been told Ella's in 3 different ways. Mind you, that now wasn't the right time. The Thursday before I was fired, he strolled over to my desk and softly said, "I'm considering quitting." I had said I understood. At the time, I hardly knew that by the next afternoon the question would no longer apply to me. I texted him Saturday morning. I said, "I'm starting something. Get on it, I think you should do. Can we talk tomorrow?" He responded in 4 minutes. "So I was waiting for you to ask." That told me he had been pondering this longer than Thursday. Which told me that what I believed a spontaneous edict was, in fact, a collision of minds, 2 people accommodating to the decision that Friday afternoon had only quickened. By the end of Sunday evening I had a name, co-founder, anchor client for $2.4 million, 3 other relationships to cultivate, and legal pad of notes detailing as best I could who was I and what was being built and why. Less than 48 hours before, I had been sacked. I had never felt more ready for something in my life. Jerome and I had coffee. the Monday after the Friday, at a little spot near his apartment, but not too close to Meridian because neither of us wanted to run into anyone from that world, until we were ready to walk in its pretty presence, which meant he came with his own legal pad, and which told me everything I needed to know. Jerome is a person who writes to think. You can tell that he is thinking well if something has a writing tool nearby. By the time he sat down, he had filled 3 pages. We literally compared notes, and what we realized was that we had not colluded on this structure, but had both independently hit upon it, which is precisely what happens when 2 people have spent 6 years in the same soup, finally allowed to think without being in that soup anymore. We settled the equity division. We agreed on the name. We had a clear view of operating model, deliberately small, and deliberately brilliant, the complete antithesis of Meridian. Less stuff, higher quality at premium delivery prices. Jerome as a co-founder is someone we often rode around, but he matters to the story in a much bigger way than just his involvement with our business. For that reason, it was not so different from my own, the constant italics of the idea that one's work will eventually be recognized. But also a particular trap at Meridian, an institution that needs your skill and talent, but refuses to respect it. Jerome had been at Meridian for 3 promotions longer than he should have. He had, in those years, created essence of controlled frustration that I identified closely with Ella's same thing, and was the measure of an impressive professional working room, which refuses to fully acknowledge it. Who has concluded that leaving without a plan is worse than staying with one and waiting specifically for when the plan is ready. The moment was ready. We incorporated on Tuesday. I will not pretend it was smooth. It wasn't. The first weeks were exactly the kind of chaos you would imagine when you have 2 people trying to build systems, whilst simultaneously servicing a client and also stumbling into how to be co-founders rather than just colleagues. Because it turns out that's an entirely different relationship that requires entirely different conversations. But the chaos was ours. That was the difference. Every challenge we encountered was a challenge that we had the opportunity to address ourselves, without seeking permission from Keith, without waiting for a committee of graybeards to gather and then pontificate about how no one needed whatever it was in order for it to win their approval. Marcus completed his transition at the 60-day point. In the first month, he sent us 3 referrals, the kind of good clients who ask him who he's moved to. You know what I mean. Well, one of those referrals also became our second anchor. We replaced my Meridian salary by the 3rd month. At 5 months, we had removed Jerome's. By month 6, we had 7 people, an office, a pipeline, and the particular kind of confidence that only comes from what should have been obvious belief. All along, this work was always theirs, and the address was never fixed. So then, one Tuesday morning when I was in month 6, I checked my email, and there was a name I recognized in the notifications of who used our recruitment platform. I sat quite still at my desk, as I had stood very still on a Friday in March, and read the title twice before I opened the request. I want to share the shape of those 6 months with you, because shape matters. Not only outcome matters, but the daily texture of what it feels like to have built something out of nothing in that unique aftermath landscape, after being told publicly that you cannot. The hardest month I have faced was that first one. We often sum up how hard this kind of work is in just a sentence: I did the thing. Which was hard. Yeah, could have been worse, and pushed through. But I want to be honest about it, because anyone who starts facing something impossible may wonder whether the hard part is survivable. It is survivable, but it is actually hard. Waking up almost every day at 5 a.m. for the first month, as my nervous system concluded that to sleep in past 5 was a privilege not yet deserved. I worked through most weekends. I spoke to my mom 3 times about whether I had done the right thing, and in 2 of them cried. This is relevant because the crying is part of reality and only the true version is worth telling. What got me through the first month was not belief. Belief came later. The specific, hard fact of Marcus Hale still existing was what kept me alive. He arrived for our inaugural client meeting in our plundered conference room, and he treated us with the same level of respect that he had reserved for Meridian's 14th floor. That respect was not charity. Marcus Hale does not do charitable work in a professional manner. He was there because the work was good, and he knew the work would be good, because he'd been watching me do it for 3 years, and that the work had never meant Meridian to him. The work had always been me. He was the anchor holding everything from drifting during a month 1. The first referrals had started rolling in by month 2. This is what happens. You do stellar work and have to spend the rest of your time working in a system that doesn't notice. But the clients notice, even if the institution does not. The referrals by Marcus were that of people who had passed along a recommendation, one they trust she is the one that actually did the work, but couldn't say. We received calls from people I had never met who had been told by long-time patients of mine that something was different, and this was the new address to reach it. Our first employee was hired in month 3. Month 3 you had outgrown the borrowed conference room and signed a lease. I stopped waking up at 5 a.m. in the 5th month, not because the work became easier. It has gotten more complex, really, in precisely the manner in which success creates complexity at every level. I no longer got up at 5 because my fear was gone. Not of failure. I was still afraid, and am still afraid, of professional failure in a healthy way that maintains a high standard. I was no longer afraid of the sentence Keith Dalton would receive. Never work here again. I had been in that city every day since he said it, and the city apparently did not get his memo about its crime problem, and by month 5 the phrase was kind of treating it like some bad weather event you prepare for that ends up being a light shower after all. It happened. It was real. Login attempt was unsuccessful. And then month 6, Tuesday morning. The recruitment platform notification. His name, Jerome, came up with the recruitment platform. He had also, as a systems thinker and one who was thinking about how to manage the hiring we both knew was coming, set up an integration with one of the major platforms so applications came directly into our project management software. This meant they were organized and trackable easily, rather than informal referrals that think would work indefinitely but which neither of us felt was going to be sustainable for long. It was a good system, so we had already been on for 6 weeks and had made 3 good hires. Then a Tuesday morning in month 6, I received a ping from the platform new application, Senior Director, Client Strategy. The role had been live for 4 days prior. As we were scaling, we required an experienced individual to step in and manage the day-to-day management of 2 of our accounts that were both mid-sized. Previously managed out of a more junior individual. Someone senior enough with great credentials to help lead those client relationships independently. One point worth noting for us is that the salary was good. We were able to pay at the top of market, and so, it worked nicely with regard to the type of person we wanted. I saw the note on my phone box while getting out of bed. It was early. I still woke at dawn and could not shake it, even if none of the fear remained, just an appreciation of the first quiet hour. Pulling up the applicant, I scrolled to the I read it once. I placed my phone face down on the side table. I stared at the ceiling for a moment. I then hung up the phone and read it again, as I have been trained to do, having built a career around consequential information. Read important things twice before responding. Keith Dalton. The name was Keith Dalton. The man who a Friday afternoon, 6 months earlier, had stood in the middle of a floor and told 30 people I would never work in this city again, had applied to go to work for me in this company, founded by me 3 days after he said that. I got up. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the entire application on my laptop and slowly read it. How you read something you want to make sure you are understanding correctly. Jory had apparently formatted it all well. Somebody else had helped him. Or he had a template for this. Or in flight time was spent on something far more substantive than busy work that involved managing up. The experience section was appropriately formatted. The summary at the top exuded confidence in a way that only someone who had gone through their career being told how impressive they are could possess, without ever verifying. Then I reached the accomplishments section. The bullet points that are supposed to show, in concrete terms, what someone has done and why they are qualified for what they seek. I read the first point. I read the second. And I reached the third, the biggest, the most prominent, placed it center stage in the section because this is what he wanted the reader to see above all else. This was his ostensive crown jewel of a professional self-presentation. And I froze. Developed and led Meridian Consulting's largest client, Hale & Partners, now Wasecom Partners, from startup to a 2.4M annual revenue account through customized service delivery and all phases of relationship management. I put my coffee cup down. Hale & Partners, my account, the cold called, pitched, won and matured over 3 years through 17-minute phone calls and late proposals to an unsolicited but keen client who now would expect you to know their business better than they did. The account that had been in my portfolio and was managed by me, the account Marcus called the reason I moved when people would ask him why he changed firms. That account, and he had listed it as his accomplishment. His examples of strategic relationship management. His crown jewel. He was applying to run it again. He just didn't know that it has existed here. I sat for 20 minutes with that bullet point before I called Jerome. I should be clear on what I was doing for those 20 minutes, because it was not, or not only, the pleasure that might derive from reading such an inversion of a humiliation. It was something more technical. I was seeking the truth of what Keith Dalton really believed about his actions and mine, and if false claim honorare summe is a lie-o an interesting thing. A self-deception so whole that he began to believe it. It's an important distinction. Here's why. A liar knows what he is lying about and wishes to hide it. The film maker who had whole cloth assimilated another's work as his own has done a more lasting kind of overwriting. He has rewritten the internal record, not just the external one. And the internal rewrite is in some ways worse, since it's self-reinforcing. Each time Keith had brought the Hale account to a board meeting, each time he'd included it on a proposal, each time he'd referenced it in pushing for a raise or title, there was just that bit more ownership of the story. 6 months later, at a time when his career was obviously pretty dire and he needed to appear impressive, I suspect he was quite genuine in thinking the account was his triumph. And that made me feel different about what I was about to do. Not for the decision. I had decided before even calling Jerome. But the tenor of it, a man who knew everything he had done, and was hoping I wouldn't go after him. It was going to be combative with a man who might stroll into that interview room, and take a seat across from me, and not understand, for at least the first 2 minutes, why the world had come arranged in this fashion. I called Jerome. I said, the director position was applied for by Keith Dalton. A pause. Jerome does not perform reactions. Did he? He put Hale Partners as his focus for achievement. Another pause. Longer. Then Jerome said with a professional delight that I could only describe as something at once controlled and precise. What do you intend to do? I told him. He said, I think that is spot on. So I open the platform, and I advance Keith Dalton's application to the next stage. I reply with the automated response, thank you for applying. We would like to schedule you for an interview. Please choose a time from here. He worked Thursday at 10 a.m., I confirmed it. Then I called Simone, who had left Meridian 2 months after me for her own reasons, and whom I trusted more than anyone else, with the particular feel of what was happening next. She answered immediately. I told her of the application, the point on the achievement line. The interview is Thursday. After a moment of silence, she said, does he know it's your company? I said, the posting refers to the company by name. Appendix. I don't know if he connected it. He doesn't put that together, she said. With certainty. He wouldn't have applied if it felt connected. She was right. Which meant Thursday was going to be a very particular kind of room. I would like to give you a little insight into why I booked the interview. Not to gloat. That is the enraging version of this story I have been so stoutly resisting becoming, because to gloat is a parochial emotion, and we are operating in grander territory here, not for the joy of seeing him comprehend, although I would be lying if that played no role. I scheduled it because, despite the improbability one examines any similar story for what could be the circumstances, leading to a serious and reasonable inquiry and debaucherbers or challenge to officialdom. This was indeed a worthy professional response by another former holder of authority in finance who obviously should have gotten his turn. So Keith Dalton deserved to sit there and hear from someone who was indeed on a team that had done all he claimed he'd done. Thus, I scheduled it. I will justify the second part for you. For 6 years, Keith had taken credit in front of rooms full of people who believed him for work I had done. The board meetings, the client presentations, the yearly reviews where his telling of my numbers made it sound like his strategy, but my execution. Never had I corrected the record in any of those rooms, because to correct it would have made me be the one with a problem. The problematic employee, not a real team player, unable to accept that leadership gets credit, and that's just how it works. I had absorbed it. No, I had allowed the record to accumulate. It was Thursday whose the record had been corrected. Not in a petty way. I wasn't going to embarrass him the way he had me. Not that he didn't deserve it. But I didn't want to be that person, and besides, the correction was enough in and of itself. I was going to sit down in a room across from him and say, calmly, no theatrics. This is what really happened. This account, which is the success you have ascribed to yourself, is run out of this office by me darn near since the day after you said I would never work in this city again. That's the reality of what you designed. I also wanted. This was the part that, in some way, felt most about needing to understand. I needed to know if Keith Dalton, on some level, understood what he had done to me and to the people in his orbit, or if he sailed through 6 years of coached down brilliance and stolen accolades and public disgrace, with the real confusion of a man not at all sure why things continued not working out for him as planned. That answer did not change how the interview went. It would, however, change what I said in the finale of it, and I wanted to say the right thing. Thursday arrived. I was in the office by 8. I read the rest of his application one last time, not the achievements, but everything else. The career history, the skills listed, the references, who I did not reach out to but documented. Then I thought about that Friday in March, and the parking garage, Marcus's voice saying whatever it is, I'm in, and the legal pad on my kitchen table, and 7 people sitting in an office that hadn't existed 6 months before. And I realized this is what I am ready for. This room. The front desk called at 9:58. Keith Dalton had arrived. He strolled in exactly at 10, which told me he'd been waiting in the lobby for several minutes, which told me he was the type of individual who schedules his arrivals to seem punctual rather than excited. It was the suit, the charcoal one, the one he wore for important meetings. I'd seen it at 100 board presentations. He looked like Keith. That was the first thing I thought. He looked just like Keith, unchanged, the same calibrated sturdiness about him, as if he had stepped out of a dark room for 3 years and now just walked back in, still filling whatever space he occupied with an implied premise that everyone around him was happy to have him there. As he came through the conference room door, he spotted me and halted. Overtly, not a trip but the moment that Sherman is captured mid-step, almost stopped in their tracks, physical proof of information entering an overheated body, before a conscious mind has time to grasp it. I stood up. Keith. I motioned to the chair on the other side of the table. Thank you for coming in. He sat. He was reconfiguring. I could see it. The quick turnaround of a guy who trained for one place but ended up in another. Instantaneously, he was deciding between coincidence and something more sinister, and his face cycled through the options with less discipline than he typically kept. He started. I didn't realize that it was my company, I said. We maintained a quite simple approach to the branding. It was not something that you would necessarily know from the posting. He nodded. He was settling now. The professional detachment creeping back in, because Keith Dalton had been in hard rooms before, and he knew it was composure you clung to when you didn't know what else to cling to. He attempted a light chuckle, the mock chuckle. Quite a thing. It is, I said. Retraining. I opened the folder before me, his application, his CV. I placed it on that table between us. I read your application carefully. I'd like to talk through it. He looked at the folder. I watched him look at it. Of course. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Hale & Partners account, said I. I held my voice stiff, so it was still like it had been in the parking garage. Not cold. Still. How did you go about building it? The silence afterward was the single longest of all in the interview. No words needed, for a longer silence than I had presumed, because what I was expecting, and had been preparing for, is either a variant of that lie, or this variant of the realization. What I received was something more intricate. I saw Keith Dalton's face do, in the space of 8 seconds, that journey I believe everyone travels when something they have been fighting hard to keep hidden for a very long time suddenly is no longer manageable. The poise held, and then dulled, and then tightened once more. And then calmly, "You called him." "I did," I said. "You proposed the account." "I did." "And you? You grew it." "I did all of it," I said, not with heat, with precision. All of it is the precision of someone carrying off a record. All meetings leading up to annual reviews. Every proposal. Every renegotiation. I built that account, Keith. I went to the reviews, and you called it a divisional win, and I let you, because pointing this out would have cost me more than what it costed you. And then you fired me. And the account followed me, because it was never yours. He was quiet. The calm was gone now, not broken, just put aside as something he had decided was no longer load-bearing. He had looked older than I remember, not aged in body maybe. Just the particular aging that comes from a sudden moment of clear sight, and not liking what you see. This is the other thing that I want to say, my summary sentence. On the Friday. You're never going to work in this town again. I let that sit for a moment. You've lived your entire career in this city. You know how it works. That was one of those sentences that you either thought I could convince to believe or something you were content spitting out in front of others in order to humiliate me. For 6 months, I have been wondering which it was. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, and then he said, softly and with startling honesty, as if I had never heard him speak before, "I said it because I was mad, and because I had no idea what else to do with you." Well, what else did I have on ya? Not a threat after all, not a prophecy, a confession of bewilderment. A man who had no idea how to handle someone like this, whose actions outran the existing category, and responded in the only manner his mind gave him, by expelling her and sentencing her to what a good lawsuit would follow behind. I sat with that for a moment. And then I said what I had set out to say. And then, I said Sepil and still say, "I'm not going to give you the job. I'm saying this on the front end, because I don't want any uncertainty on that point to shape the rest of this conversation, not because of the what happened, at least, not primarily. Because the position has to do with managing client relationships that were founded on a certain level of trust, and you left such an impression with those clients, which means that trust is non-existent." He nodded. He had expected this. "I want to find where I should have said this, in one of those rooms where you pitched my work as if it were your own, but didn't. The Hale account, and the 3 accounts I came in with when I left you, were built upon something you'd struggled to manage down, and never quite succeeded managing down. Which is why you ultimately had to take each of those accounts from me instead. That thing is worth naming. It is the skill that can identify what a client needs before they say it out loud. The understanding so you can architect a service around that. To be able to get someone professionally to feel really seen. Those are not divisional achievements. They are not caused by a firm's strategy or an oversight on the part of some director. They are a certain attribute of a different person, and that different person was not you. I paused. The next part was important. I did not want it to land like a wound, so I had to say this correctly. I said, "You had something that I did not have. You had the title, and the room and access. All the things that establishments grant to a certain type of individual. I had the work. And for 6 years you gave me the work and I gave you the access. And it was an exchange that worked, if not a balanced one, and whether or not I would have built this without those 6 years of practice at the exchange. So I'm not here to only complain, and I'm here with a company that exists partly because of everything I learned inside yours." He was now looking at me with the attention that a man pays to receiving information he will contemplate for years. Not safe attention. True, reduce your ass in the fire attention. "The sentence," I said. "You just said it to hit me where I hurt, Stavanger. I want you to understand the actual effect it had. It took all I had been asking for permission to do, and it shoved me into a parking garage with a box set of will-do, glimmering sometimes. And I come home and with the box. I built this. In a way that is completely unintended. And not one for which I am thanking you." That sentence was just what I needed. The final wall was just the last wall that I needed to come down. You told me I would never work in this city again, and you were so wrong. It took 6 months of clarity for me to realize just how wrong you truly are. I closed the folder. I hope that's useful to you, not as consolation, as data. He stood when I stood. For a moment, he looked like he was going to say something. I saw him think it through, the words forming and dissolving. What he spoke at the door was, "You're better than I give you credit for." It was the least he could do, and I grasped that it was also the most he had to give at that point. And I took in for what it was. "I know," I said, not unkindly, just accurately. He left. I saw him leave through the glass wall of the conference room, walk across the floor, where 7 people I had hired were on computers working on things that I had made, and through to reception and out, then into the lifts. I finally collapsed back in the chair, at the empty table, and let it all be over. I texted Jerome, "It's done." He texted back, "Good." Marcus called. He follows by nominating someone new for us. I laughed, the genuine kind, a straightforward laugh devoid of any baggage. I typed, "Just tell him we will make room." And I meant it. We always make room. That is the problem with constructing something upon work that was always yours. There is far more space than those who contained you thought. Let me take you through where everyone fell in. It took 6 months, but eventually Keith left the city. Not by anything drastic. A place at a firm in another market, an easy-going move. That comes through Simone verbatim, who still tracks this stuff. I don't desire harm of a particular nature to him. I don't wish him anything. He is just not the size of my ceiling anymore. Jerome and I have grown the firm to 22 employees. Marcus Hale is still our anchor client, and put us in touch with 11 others over 2 years. It is work I am proud to do. Not famous work, the flashy stuff, but the sort that simply gets done right and delivers results clients mention when asked who they trust. We are establishing a reputation that cannot be owned or managed down by anyone. Simone joined us in year 2. She runs operations. I tell her she is the best hire I have made, and she tells me that's a low fucking bar. Because you've also hired Jerome, who doesn't even know how to shut his laptop down. Jerome has always disagreed with that description of himself, and never learned how to close his laptop when he hears the word no. My mother asked me the other day if I ever contemplated that line. "You'll never work here again." And if it still hurt, I thought about it. The parking garage and the cardboard box and the legal pad and the Tuesday morning and Keith's face when he saw me in that conference room. So I replied, "It no longer hurts. This is the beginning of the story only." Every story needs a beginning. No, what does a story that begins with getting fired sound like? I said, "It's like a ringing phone. And someone picking up and going, whatever, I'm in." The moment you begin your story isn't always there for choosing. All you have to do is wait for it, with a phone charged, and the kind of client who actually answers their phone, and a parking garage where in 7 minutes you can determine who the fuck you are going to be on the other side of it. DNA doesn't like, and neither does the work. It was always my work, it just needed an address that let it in. I found the address. I put my name on the door. Much to my surprise, the city had a lot of room for me. DNA doesn't lie, but contempt. Contempt is always a choice. And it always ends up costing the person who chooses it more than they think. Keith picked it on a Friday afternoon in front of 30 people, in a room he turned out to manage. He didn't own the room. He never owned the room. I was the room. If this story found its way to you, if, through your experience of rent in a containers and cuffs city, someone has told you in one way or another that there is no longer a place for you somewhere gold, dipped because important people must be given important things, then do the 2 things I always say. Stay tuned. These stories find their way to you if subscribed. And let me know in the comments, tell your age, and tell who you're going to convince of wrong. You do not have to tell them. Simply put it here in a comment where 200,000 visitors who have set foot in that parking garage are going to see it and recognize precisely what it means. I read every one. Next week, a woman whose family seated her in the wrong room at every gathering for 8 years, until she learned that the house they gathered in was bequeathed to her in a will no one had given the time of day to read. You are going to want to be there! So glad you stayed with me. Go find your parking garage. Sit with it for as long as you need to. and then make the call.